The sudden stillness over the river did not last long. Within hours, the calm surface turned into a corridor of chaos, a chain of Russian armored vehicles, once moving in formation, now stranded in the mud, their engines half submerged, their paths cut off by rising water. Officially, this was described as an unexpected weather complication. But by all indications, the real cause lay elsewhere. According to field reports received throughout the day, the situation unfolded rapidly after a series of unconfirmed strikes on temporary crossings near the main logistics artery connecting the northern and central sectors. At first, the disruption seemed minor, a tactical inconvenience, nothing more. Yet as reconnaissance footage began to circulate among military analysts, the scale became clear: a significant armored contingent immobilized near the river, cut off from supply and communication. The official explanation emphasized terrain instability. In expert circles, however, another theory began to take shape. By midday, satellite images revealed makeshift pontoons scattered across both banks, many of them damaged beyond repair. Several units attempted to reposition, but according to sources familiar with the operation, the water level had already risen beyond the threshold for armored movement. Flood Run, as some insiders have started to call it, was not a spontaneous incident. It appeared coordinated, timed to coincide with an unexpected wave of precision attacks targeting key infrastructure nodes. The strikes effectively severed one of the most critical logistical links in the area, halting movement along the corridor that, until recently, remained the backbone of supply efforts. In these hours, tension grew not only on the ground but also in the command networks. Communication intercepts, reviewed by independent analysts, suggest a breakdown in coordination between frontline logistics and regional command. Officially, the situation was under control. Unofficially, the tone had shifted. Reports described vehicles idling in shallow waters, crews ordered to hold positions without clear directives. Between the lines, it was evident, the halt was not temporary. It was systemic. At this stage, what seemed like an isolated disruption began to take on a broader meaning. Flooding as a tactic, not just nature's accident but a controlled variable in a larger strategy. Analysts recalled previous cases where terrain manipulation had been used to delay offensives, but this time, the precision of the timing raised questions that few dared to voice publicly. In military briefings, the term weather interference appeared repeatedly, but behind closed doors, discussions focused on electronic interference and satellite-guided detonation patterns, suggesting a far more complex scenario. In expert discussions, one phrase surfaced with increasing frequency: engineered isolation. It described not only the stranded vehicles but also the communication blackout that followed. By the time the first aerial images reached open channels, the entire segment of the front appeared frozen, silent, unreachable, cut off from reinforcement. Yet even the silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, across analytical networks, comparisons were drawn to previous episodes of strategic entrapment. Some argued that this event might mark a turning point, a moment when terrain, technology, and timing merged into a single asymmetric tactic. Others warned against premature conclusions, emphasizing the volatility of the situation and the limited visibility of verified data. But beyond the cautious statements, one observation dominated: the disruption appeared too synchronized to be accidental. The sequence of events during the day left a lingering sense that the situation was evolving faster than official reports could acknowledge. Each new update revealed not clarity, but deeper ambiguity. The stranded columns were more than a logistical failure, they were a signal, a message sent through silence and stillness. According to some insiders, additional measures were already being prepared to contain potential fallout from the operation. Whether those measures would succeed remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the interruption of a single corridor had already altered the balance of the entire operational landscape. At this point, experts began to note a subtle shift in public statements. Phrases like localized disruption replaced earlier assurances of stability. The language grew colder, more cautious, as though preparing the ground for developments still unseen. Perhaps it is worth staying alert to how this story unfolds further. After all, as some sources quietly noted today, the most significant shifts often begin not with explosions, but with silence over the water. By this point, the narrative of a simple weather setback no longer aligned with observable facts. Throughout the day, information continued to surface: fragments of intercepted transmissions, satellite readings, and internal briefings that suggested the flooding had been anything but spontaneous. Analysts from multiple defense monitoring centers confirmed that water levels in the affected basin rose sharply within a time window too narrow to be natural. The cause, they implied, was deliberate. In several corridors, controlled demolitions of upstream barriers had redirected the river's course with surgical precision. Officially, no one acknowledged this. Unofficially, it became clear, the terrain itself had turned into a weapon. In the hours that followed, the tone of communications changed. Military channels, once overloaded with operational data, grew sparse. Reports mention that command centers began rerouting logistics convoys far from the impacted sector, avoiding exposure to additional strikes. In analytical summaries reviewed by our editorial team, it is noted that nearly a third of all heavy transport assets in that corridor were rendered immobile. But the figure was not the core of the problem. The real issue lay in what this interruption signaled. According to sources close to the monitoring mission, the flooding coincided precisely with a wave of electronic interference across the region. Navigation systems, drone control frequencies, and even encrypted communications experienced simultaneous disruptions. Accidental overlap was the official phrasing. But in expert circles, the overlap was described differently, as a coordinated act of disorientation, designed to paralyze command structures at the exact moment ground mobility collapsed. Between the lines of official reports, the word sabotage began to circulate, though never publicly. By early afternoon, the first attempts at repair began, mobile engineering units trying to re-establish a bridgehead under constant observation from aerial reconnaissance. Yet even these efforts appeared hesitant, constrained by the uncertainty of who controlled the surrounding airspace. Sources within international monitoring agencies described the operation as unusually cautious, as if both sides were aware of something beyond the visible battlefield. In analytical commentaries, a quiet consensus began to form. The incident was not only tactical but symbolic. The immobilized tanks, the fractured communications, the engineered flood, all elements of a message, one directed as much to the front as to the watching world. Each image circulating in closed channels told a similar story: mass and machinery defeated not by direct fire, but by precision in timing and control. For strategists observing from afar, it was an illustration of a new warfare dynamic, where infrastructure became both weapon and target. At the same time, domestic channels avoided direct acknowledgement. Statements remained cautious, referring only to temporary logistical interruptions and adverse terrain conditions. Yet in the same briefings, shifts in tone began to appear. Phrases like tactical pause and temporary repositioning replaced earlier assurances of stability. The words themselves seemed chosen not to clarify, but to contain. According to one insider familiar with the briefings, the decision to maintain informational restraint reflected deeper concerns, not about immediate losses, but about exposure of operational vulnerabilities that were never meant to be seen. Meanwhile, independent analysts began drawing broader conclusions. They pointed to the convergence of environmental manipulation, signal disruption, and psychological messaging, a triad that suggested deliberate orchestration. It wasn't just about stopping movement, it was about rewriting perception. The stranded convoy, the flooded plane, the visible stillness, together, they formed a picture carefully composed to send a message of vulnerability. In the following hours, that perception began to influence external reactions. Observers across multiple regions reported sudden shifts in monitoring behavior, increased satellite focus, redirected surveillance flights, new alignments of data tracking. While officials insisted the situation was contained, the very scale of international observation implied the opposite. In private discussions among military analysts, the term controlled exposure began to circulate. It referred to the idea that one side might have intentionally allowed visibility into a localized failure to conceal deeper operations elsewhere. The concept was controversial, but it explained the unusual calm in official communications, as though the silence itself had been pre-arranged. At this stage, the narrative evolved from an episode of terrain interference to something far more intricate. What appeared to be a setback now resembled a rehearsal, a controlled display of vulnerability. And as the day unfolded, the question shifted from what happened to what was meant to be seen. In the corridors of defense think tanks, the tone of assessment grew sharper. This was not an accident, one summary concluded, it was a statement. But as often happens in such situations, the most important statement was not in what was said, but in what remained unsaid. Still, the atmosphere in analytical communities stayed restrained, as if awaiting confirmation of what many already suspected. Officially, no new information appeared. Unofficially, the silence itself became evidence. By this hour, it was no longer about tanks or rivers. It was about perception. Who controlled it, who shaped it, and who would act upon it next. The stillness along the river, magnified across screens and reports, became the mirror of a larger tension spreading beyond the battlefield. And yet, beneath the restrained tone of official briefings, a quiet realization surfaced, that the line between natural disaster and strategic design had all but disappeared. In expert discussions, they began to call it a threshold moment. The point at which warfare stopped being about territory and started being about control over the flow of information itself. By the middle of the day, the narrative surrounding the flood began to fracture. What was initially presented as an operational delay was now being dissected inside analytical units across several regions. The tone of discussion had changed, from cautious observation to quiet recognition that the situation unfolding near the river was part of something larger. According to data obtained by monitoring centers, new satellite sequences revealed precise ruptures along the embankment lines, evenly spaced, measured, deliberate. They did not resemble natural erosion. Each breach matched the coordinates of known engineering points, once used to regulate seasonal water flow. Someone had known exactly where to strike. Official statements remained restrained, describing the situation as under technical control. Yet by this hour, internal reports pointed to rising uncertainty in command structures. The convoy immobilized on the floodplain had become both a tactical and a psychological factor. Crews remained in position without orders to withdraw, effectively serving as visible proof of the disruption's success. In expert discussions, the phrase symbolic paralysis began to circulate, a description not of destruction, but of forced stillness used as an instrument of influence. Between the lines of situational updates, a new detail surfaced. The flooding had coincided with a shift in the digital environment, a surge in false coordinates across several mapping systems, effectively distorting navigational data. Officially, this interference was attributed to atmospheric anomalies. But those who tracked the pattern noticed that the distortion aligned too precisely with key communication zones to be random. In several analytical summaries, it was described as an information trap, a space engineered to confuse movement, distort command perception, and amplify hesitation. By this point, the discussion within strategic circles moved beyond the local event. Analysts began linking it to a broader sequence of coordinated operations designed to strain logistics and command integrity. In the words of one defense observer cited in restricted briefings, it's not just a river, it's a mirror of how control collapses when terrain becomes data. The observation resonated quietly, hinting that the real battleground had shifted from geography to perception. At the same time, unofficial sources described a subtle transformation in communication strategy. While no side directly claimed responsibility, the rhythm of statements began to follow a recognizable pattern: denial, pause, controlled release. Each fragment of new information seemed calibrated to maintain uncertainty rather than resolve it. In analytical networks, this approach was described as strategic silence, a deliberate restraint meant to confuse observers while shaping the informational tempo. In these hours, the role of the flood itself appeared secondary to its narrative function. The stranded tanks, the isolated crossings, the blurred command maps, together they created a visual story of immobilization, of a system caught between visibility and vulnerability. The more the image circulated, the less anyone questioned its authenticity. It had become self-sustaining, a symbol of breakdown, regardless of whether the breakdown was real or staged. However, behind the restrained surface, new data began to emerge that challenged even this version. According to insiders familiar with satellite analysis, the initial flood zones expanded in directions inconsistent with natural flow. Certain segments drained faster than expected, as if redirected by controlled channels beneath the surface. Engineering within engineering, one observer called it a layered manipulation, where artificial flooding concealed deeper structural works. The implication was unsettling. The event may have been designed not to trap, but to test. In expert circles, that possibility sparked a new wave of speculation. If the flooding had been orchestrated, what was it meant to measure: response time, infrastructure resilience, or psychological readiness? None of the briefings offered answers, but the sequence of reactions suggested that someone was watching, timing, recording. The river, once a static feature, had become a living variable in a larger equation. Meanwhile, in closed sessions of policy advisors, the conversation turned to information control. Several officials reportedly proposed limiting visual access to the affected area, arguing that the longer the images circulated, the stronger their narrative impact would grow. But such measures came too late. The footage had already reached multiple international monitoring platforms. Within hours, the flood had ceased to be a local incident, it had become a global broadcast of vulnerability. By this time, public tone grew muted. No accusations, no admissions, only procedural phrases: assessment ongoing, response measures under review. The language of bureaucracy replaced the language of command. Yet to those who followed the signals closely, the silence was telling. When statements flatten, it means pressure is rising, remarked one analytical bulletin, published under anonymity. Between the cautious phrasing and the absence of decisive movement, a new interpretation gained ground, that both sides had an interest in keeping the narrative suspended. The immobilized vehicles were no longer a loss to be recovered, but a spectacle to be maintained. The longer they remained stranded, the more powerful the message of control and disruption became. At this juncture, experts started referring to the episode as a demonstration event, a limited-scale operation designed to show capability without triggering escalation. Yet no one could say with certainty who orchestrated it. The ambiguity itself was part of the design. By the time the final briefings were released, one observation resonated most clearly: the flood was not just a natural or engineered event. It was a test of perception, coordination, and trust, a reminder that in modern conflict, even silence and still water can become instruments of control. Perhaps it is for that reason that many analysts, reviewing the day's developments, chose not to draw conclusions at all. Instead, they left a single note at the end of their summaries: monitor developments closely. A phrase that, by now, sounds less like a recommendation and more like a quiet invitation to stay connected, to keep watching, to not look away. By this stage, the situation near the river had ceased to be local. What began as a logistical interruption was now discussed in the same breath as information warfare and regional deterrence. In the analytical bulletins circulating through security networks, the tone had shifted noticeably, from observation to interpretation. The event was no longer described as an incident, but as a signal act, a term reserved for operations whose meaning lies not in their immediate result, but in what they reveal about strategic intent. According to reports reviewed throughout the day, additional reconnaissance flights documented extensive redeployment patterns surrounding the flood zone. Entire sections of supply infrastructure appeared to have been rerouted, not in panic, but with calculated precision. It looked less like a reaction and more like a rehearsal, one defense analyst noted in a restricted briefing. The pattern implied premeditation, as if both sides had anticipated disruption and were now testing their contingency responses. Officially, none of this was acknowledged. Statements remained short, mechanical, and deliberately stripped of interpretation. "Operations continue as planned," read one of them. But beneath this formulaic language, the strategic texture of the day was clear. Communications traffic indicated an abnormal increase in encrypted transfers between logistical command and remote observation units. In plain terms, the system was recalibrating itself, quietly, under the guise of routine control. At this point, the focus of discussion moved from the flood itself to the invisible mechanisms it exposed. Analysts highlighted three distinct layers: engineered flooding as a trigger, communication blackout as a veil, and narrative control as containment. Together, they formed what one insider called the anatomy of denial, a strategy designed to hide operational adjustments behind a spectacle of environmental chaos. Each layer functioned to mask the next, creating a structure where truth was technically visible, but context remained inaccessible. In several monitoring agencies, experts began tracing the correlation between the timing of the river surge and cyber disruptions in nearby regions. The alignment was too exact to dismiss. For approximately 2 hours, multiple civilian systems experienced delays in data transmission, power grids, transport logistics, even air traffic communications showed anomalies. None of these incidents were directly linked, but their simultaneity suggested coordination. "It's the precision that gives it away," one analyst remarked. "Coincidence doesn't synchronize to the second." Meanwhile, diplomatic reactions unfolded with characteristic restraint. Official representatives avoided references to responsibility, focusing instead on climate resilience and technical stability. Yet in confidential correspondence between policy advisors, the concern was explicit: the event had demonstrated the vulnerability of critical movement corridors, not only physical but digital. One internal note described the flood as an operational X-ray, exposing weaknesses that might otherwise have remained hidden for months. In the media space, silence prevailed. Visual coverage of the flooded convoy was quietly withdrawn from several outlets, replaced with broader environmental reports. The shift was subtle but noticeable. It reflected an unwritten agreement to reduce visibility until the strategic implications were assessed. In expert discussions, this maneuver was interpreted not as censorship but as containment, a way to slow down interpretation, to let the narrative settle before it hardens into meaning. By mid-afternoon, however, new information disturbed this equilibrium. Surveillance images captured unexpected movement upstream, what appeared to be additional releases from auxiliary reservoirs, widening the flooded area. The official version continued to frame this as a hydrological aftereffect. But analysts who examined the sequence noticed that the second wave of flooding expanded precisely toward the nearest supply route, effectively doubling the isolation zone. The precision of that directionality reignited speculation about intent. At this moment, discussions inside intelligence briefings turned from tactical to systemic. If this was deliberate, one report stated, then it demonstrates an unprecedented level of environmental weaponization, the use of controlled water flows as real-time barriers. In the same breath, another line appeared, if it was not deliberate, then it shows the inability to maintain environmental control during active operations. Both interpretations were equally alarming. Between these conflicting assessments, one fact remained constant: the operational tempo had slowed to near paralysis. Convoys halted. Command communications rerouted. Drones hovered but rarely engaged. It's as if everyone is waiting for a signal that never comes, remarked a monitoring officer in an internal summary. The day had turned into a study in suspended motion, not of battle, but of deliberate inaction. In this stillness, observers began to notice secondary effects. Localized shortages of fuel, intermittent power failures, and signs of logistical fatigue appeared across support networks. The flood, which had started as a physical obstruction, had rippled through the system, invisible, cumulative, quiet. "It's not the water," said one internal note, "it's the delay." The remark captured the essence of the event: disruption through inertia. In diplomatic analysis, a new hypothesis began to surface, that the event near the river was not a standalone occurrence, but a coordinated demonstration of deterrence. By immobilizing heavy assets without direct confrontation, the operation had achieved psychological dominance with minimal escalation. This is the warfare of interruption, one observer concluded, not to destroy, but to suspend. And yet, as calm statements continued to mask the underlying shifts, certain details refused to align. The timing of the second flood wave, the synchronization of communication failures, the selective release of imagery, all too precise, too choreographed to be dismissed as coincidence. By now, even the most restrained observers agreed, something far more complex was taking place beneath the surface. The flood had become a lens, revealing not just the fragility of infrastructure, but the invisible choreography of modern power, where control is exercised not through action, but through pause. In these hours, as the river continued to rise and silence deepened across command channels, one thought echoed in analytical circles, that perhaps the real battleground of the day was not the terrain itself, but the perception of control over it. And in that contest, those who dictated the rhythm of uncertainty already held the advantage. But further developments hinted that the rhythm was about to shift again. By the time the day drew toward its uncertain close, the surface of the river had settled into a deceptive calm. What hours earlier had seemed like chaos now looked motionless, a tableau of stalled machines and silent terrain. Yet beneath that stillness, the system continued to pulse. Data flows, encrypted communications, reconnaissance relays, all working, all measuring, all recording. Officially, the operation had stabilized. Unofficially, nothing had returned to normal. According to assessments compiled by regional monitoring centers, the immobilized armored units remained in position, surrounded not by water but by silence. Orders to recover them had not been issued. The explanation was procedural, assessment of terrain conditions ongoing. But among analysts, this restraint was read differently. The delay is deliberate, one internal note suggested. It maintains uncertainty. In the economy of conflict, uncertainty is currency, and today, it was being spent carefully. In the diplomatic corridors, reactions grew increasingly abstract. Words like containment, mitigation, and stabilization replaced all references to accountability. The tone of statements was unmistakably synchronized: measured pauses, cautious phrasing, intentional vagueness. According to experts in strategic communication, this alignment rarely happens spontaneously. It indicates coordination, not of policy, but of perception. "They're not responding," one observer remarked quietly, "they're harmonizing the silence." In the expert community, theories began to crystallize. Some argued that the flood had been an act of defensive deterrence, designed to test the response infrastructure of both sides. Others viewed it as a warning, a controlled showcase of what precision interference could achieve without a single missile fired. The difference between the two interpretations was almost semantic. In both, the message was clear: the physical battlefield is no longer the primary arena of control. By this stage, the day's events had evolved into a case study for modern hybrid dynamics, where the manipulation of environment, data, and information rhythm replaces direct confrontation. "It's a new form of signaling," explained one defense researcher in a confidential briefing. "You show capability through disruption, not destruction. You create a pause, and let others interpret it as threat." The insight spread quietly through analytical circles. The river had become a lesson. Meanwhile, reports continued to filter in about changing conditions on the ground. The floodwaters had begun to recede, but the vehicles remained unmoved. Engineers who approached the area described the terrain as structurally unstable. Yet some of them admitted, under anonymity, that clearance operations could have begun hours earlier. The pause was intentional, designed, perhaps, to extend visibility of the event just long enough for it to embed itself in collective analysis. This isn't just a military story anymore, one observer noted, it's an informational one. By this hour, in the calm tone of official summaries, there was a trace of fatigue. The phrasing repeated itself, looping through familiar structures, ongoing monitoring, stabilizing measures, evaluation of impact. The language of management had replaced the language of action. It was as if the narrative had been frozen, preserved in its most ambiguous form. And that ambiguity was precisely what made it effective. In analytical retrospectives prepared by evening, the term strategic pause appeared repeatedly. It described not only the halt of armored movement, but the suspension of interpretation. Every actor involved, military, political, informational, had stopped just short of clarity. Each seemed to wait for the other to define what the event meant. No one did. The silence itself became definition. According to several defense correspondents, similar disruptions in the past had led to escalation. This time, the restraint was different, measured, calculated, as if both sides understood that narrative control had become more valuable than tactical advantage. You don't need to advance, one analysis concluded, if the image of your opponent standing still achieves the same effect. By this point, the day's coverage had narrowed to carefully worded briefings. The phrase, localized weather incident, appeared again, almost ironically. But for those who had followed the signals from the beginning, the phrase now carried another meaning, a code for something managed, executed, contained. In the corridors of analytical agencies, a final thought circulated: the flood may not have been about obstruction at all. It may have been about timing, how to freeze an entire system for a single day and observe its reactions in real time. The value of such observation, in the age of algorithmic command and digital reconnaissance, cannot be overstated. The water is gone, said one post-event summary, but the delay remains. In the end, the river returned to its normal course, and the stranded vehicles stood like silent witnesses to a test few would ever acknowledge. The incident faded from headlines, absorbed into the rhythm of official statements. Yet within the analytical community, it lingered, a quiet example of how power operates when it chooses not to move. Some insiders suggest that this is only the beginning, a template for operations that blur the line between terrain, data, and psychology. Others caution that too much silence breeds instability, that ambiguity, once weaponized, cannot easily be contained. For now, all that remains is observation. The water, the silence, the deliberate stillness, each part of a language still being written. And as the world turns its attention elsewhere, those who watch today's events with the trained calm of analysts will remember how it began, with movement stopped, communication cut, and a river that suddenly decided to rise. Perhaps it is worth remembering, control does not always announce itself. Sometimes it appears as nothing at all. And sometimes, that nothing changes everything.